Association of Geochemistry. We had 2 years ago Professor Tim. Last year it was Professor Thomas Rothman, and now we have a distinguished guest, Dr. Rachael James from the University of Southampton. I will give you just a few details about Dr. James. That was so kind to get engaged in this tour. She just came from Bucharest, where she was studying at the Institute of Biology of the Romanian Academy, which is run by Professor Babes, a good colleague of us, and tomorrow she will leave for Sofia. She already had another lecture in Prague last month, I think. Yes, so this is an initiative of the European Association of Geochemists to spread good quality science in Central and Eastern Europe, and each year one of the renowned scientists are invited to give this lecture. So, Dr. Rachael James has a PhD at Cambridge University. After that, she was employed as a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Bristol, as a research fellow at the Natural History in London, as a senior lecturer in oceanography at the Open University in Great Britain, as a researcher at the National Oceanography Center in Southampton, and actually she's a reader in marine geochemistry, ocean and earth sciences at the University of Southampton. So today she will give us 2 lectures in a row, but probably we'll have a small break between them. The topics are very interesting. The first is weathering, ocean chemistry and climate change, new insights from non-traditional metal-stable isotopes, and the second is linkages between methane release from Arctic shelf sediments and climate change. Thank you very much. Rachael, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for inviting me to Cluj to meet with you, to discuss my science with you, and hopefully to develop some lasting interactions and collaborations with this institution. It's a real pleasure to come here and to experience what science in Romania has to offer. Okay, so the first of my lectures today then is going to focus on looking at the links between weathering, ocean chemistry and climate change through looking at a series of novel stable isotope systems. So these are stable isotope systems that we've really started to develop in the last 10 to 15 years or so with the advent of new technologies. So you might be wondering, first of all, is why are we interested in weathering processes? Why are we interested in the erosion, chemical breakdown of rocks on land? Well, the reason is shown in this diagram here, is that over long timescales, geological timescales, concentration of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere is determined by the balance between outgassing of carbon dioxide from the Earth's mantle and its subsequent consumption during weathering processes that occur on land. So in particular, the key process is weathering of silicate rocks. And you can see from this equation here that weathering of the silicate rocks, calcium and magnesium silicates, consumes 2 moles of atmospheric carbon dioxide. It converts that carbon dioxide into hydrogen carbonate ions, which are transported via rivers to the oceans. And in the oceans, those hydrogen carbonate ions combine with calcium to form calcium carbonate and carbon dioxide again. So the overall process is the consumption of 2 moles of atmospheric carbon dioxide and the burial of 1 mole of that carbon dioxide into the ocean sediments. So on long time scales, it's that process that leads to drawdown of carbon dioxide from the Earth's atmosphere. Weathering of carbonate rocks, of course, also consumes atmospheric carbon dioxide. It's basically the reverse of this process here. But once those hydrogen carbonate ions that form are transported to the ocean, they form carbon dioxide again. So again, on long time scales, weathering of carbonate rocks doesn't contribute to drawdown of atmospheric carbon dioxide. So it's really weathering of silicate rocks that we're interested in understanding if we're to understand long-term controls on climate. So what's the evidence then for linkages between weathering and climate? Well, this is the famous oxygen isotope record preserved in marine carbonate rocks back over the last 60 million years. Over that time, the oxygen isotopic composition of those carbonates has become heavier, and that's because of long-term cooling. And these estimates here, these show estimates for levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide back over those last 60 million years. The atmospheric carbon dioxide records are relatively uncertain and much more uncertain as we go back in time. But I think you can see that overall, the estimates show that there has been a long-term decline in levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide that coincide with a long-term decline in global temperatures. And weathering is linked into this process as well. So this cooling that we see over the Cenozoic period has been linked to the onset of uplift of the Himalaya. Uplift of the Himalaya provides new rock surfaces that can be eroded, so weathering rates increase. And Cenozoic cooling over the last 40 million years or so has been attributed to the uplift of the Himalaya and globally increased weathering rates. There's also evidence for shorter-term weathering controls on climate. So the MI1 event, which occurs close to the Miocene-Oligocene boundary, coincides with massive advance in the formation of ice sheets on Antarctica, driven by this cooling episode here. You can see after this cooling episode, there's a sudden increase in global temperatures, evidenced by a decrease in the delta 18 low values of marine carbonates. And that increase is attributed to reduced weathering at this time because the growth of the ice sheet prevented weathering of the Antarctic landmass, and that meant that levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide and therefore global temperature increased at this time. So how can we understand how weathering rates, and in particular silicate weathering rates, have changed in the past? Well, our principal tool for doing this until recently has been looking at the strontium isotopic composition of seawater. This is a compilation of studies back over the past 100 million years or so, put together by John MacArthur a few years ago now. It's a very well-established record, and because the main inputs of strontium to seawater come from weathering of silicate rocks and from hydrothermal activity, we can use the strontium isotopic composition of seawater to reconstruct how silicate weathering rates have changed in the past. A key problem with this proxy that's become obvious though in the last few years is that the Himalayas have a disproportionate influence on the strontium isotopic composition of seawater. they really affect the strontium isotopic composition of seawater. And it turns out that carbonate rocks in the Himalayas have radiogenic strontium isotope values similar to those that we see in the silicate rocks because of the metamorphism that's gone on there. During metamorphism, the strontium isotopic composition of the carbonates has been overprinted by interaction with the silicate rocks. So it looks like we can no longer use the silicate, the strontium isotopic composition of the river waters in the Himalaya to distinguish between weathering of silicates and carbonates. And that's shown in this diagram here, which was done by a PhD student of a colleague of mine when I was at the Open University. And it's a laser ablation study of rocks from the Himalayas. This is the strontium isotopic composition of the carbonate component of the rock. This is the strontium isotopic composition of the bulk rock. And that's the one-to-one line. So you can see that the carbonates have the same strontium isotopic composition of the bulk rock, which is predominantly silicate. So it looks like this proxy is starting to break down. Another proxy we can use is something called the chemical index of alteration. And this is done by doing bulk chemical analyses of seafloor sediments. And we look at the proportion of elements that are relatively immobile to the proportion of elements that are more mobile. And that tells us something about the weathering history. The issue with this proxy is that it integrates the weathering history because it relies on the composition of the particular material delivered by the rivers. And there's a lot of free suspension of that material, a lot of deposition in the deltas, so we can never be sure that the time slice that we're looking at is very, very, very extended. The other issue with this proxy is that it's dependent on lithology. So if the area of your drainage basin changes, so the rocks in your drainage basin change, then it's very difficult to apply it to understanding how weathering rates may have changed in the past. So we've been on the lookout for new ways of getting at past silicate weathering rates, and attention has turned to lithium and magnesium. So just to introduce these systems to you briefly, lithium has two stable isotopes, lithium-6 and lithium-7, and magnesium has three, 24 magnesium, 25 and 26 magnesium. The isotope compositions are reported as the per mole variation of the ratio of the heavy isotope to the light isotope relative to the standard. For lithium, that's standard, it's L-spec. And for magnesium, the standards are not quite so straightforward because the NIST standard is now known to be heterogeneous. So the standard we tend to use now is called DSM-3. So this is the delta notation that we use. We report the sample relative to the standard, and we multiply it by a factor of 1,000 so that we're talking in units that we can understand. And the take-home message from this really is that if we have positive delta values, then the isotopic composition of your sample is heavier than that standard. If we have negative delta values, then the isotopic composition of your sample is lighter than that of your standard. So why do we think lithium and magnesium might be good traces of weathering processes? Well, the good thing about them is that they are relatively mobile during water rock reactions. So we expect them to be eroded by the rocks and we expect them to be delivered to the rivers and therefore into the ocean. Because they're relatively light isotopes, we also expect to see large isotope fractionations in nature. And that's certainly true for lithium. The natural variation is on the order of about 60 per mil. And for magnesium, it's a bit less. So far from the analyses that have been done, it's about 8 per mil. And also the concentration of both of these elements is far higher in silicate rocks than it is in carbonate rocks. So we might expect the river composition to be dominated by the weathering of the silicate material. So I want to start then by introducing you to what we know about lithium isotopes and how we've been developing that proxy for weathering. So the key thing about lithium is that most of the lithium in rivers is derived from weathering of silicates. And that's true even in catchments that are dominated by carbonate basement rocks. So this was a study done by a PhD student of mine a few years ago now in the Himalaya. We went to a series of different catchments, some completely underlain by silicate rocks, some almost completely underlain by carbonate rocks, and others a mixture. By plotting the elemental ratios, this is to account for things like dilution effects of river waters, what we were able to show is that in the silicate-dominated catchments, around almost all of the lithium in the rivers came from weathering of silicate rocks. But also the same is true in carbonate-rich catchments. So this catchment here, which is underlain by the Tibetan sedimentary series, which is a carbonate-rich system, again, the percentage of lithium derived from trace silicates in those catchment rocks was around 94%. So almost all of the lithium in the rivers is coming from weathering silicates. So what then are the controls on the lithium isotope composition of river water? What I've plotted here is all the data that are currently available, where we have lithium isotope compositions for the dissolved phase of river water, so that's shown on the horizontal axis here, and lithium isotopic composition of the suspended particulate material measured in the same sample. This is the one-to-one line here, and you can see that all of the samples lie below that, and the reason is that the lithium isotopic composition, the dissolved phase, is always heavier than that for the suspended particles. And that's true no matter what the underlying lithology is. So we've done studies in silicate-rich catchments, basaltic catchments, carbonates, metasediments, mixed catchments, and shield regions, and in all cases we see that this is happening. So lithology doesn't play a part in controlling the lithium isotopic composition of river water. So what does then? So we could expect the isotope fractionation that we see between the river water and the particles could be the result of two different processes. It could be due to fractionation occurring during the dissolution of lithium from the rock, or it could be due to fractionation occurring during the formation of secondary mineral phases. So we conducted Josh, a PhD student of mine, conducted some laboratory experiments to explore this further. And this is his starting material here, this forsterite with a delta 7 lithium value of about 1.6 per mil. And if he did his experiment, keeping the experiment far from equilibrium conditions, so we have no precipitation of secondary mineral phases, then the lithium that's leached from that forsterite has essentially the same isotopic composition of the forsterite itself. But if we change the experimental conditions and we allow precipitation of secondary mineral phases, so we allow equilibrium conditions to be established, what we can see is that over time the isotopic composition of the fluid phase becomes heavier than that of the starting material, so the phase that's being dissolved. So the fractionation process, what this is telling us is that fractionation process is happening during the formation of the secondary minerals. And we can also see that in a real river system as well. This is the delta 7 lithium value of the river water, and plotted on the vertical axis is the difference in the lithium isotopic composition of the suspended particles and the river water. So if we go in this direction, the closer the value is to 0, that means that there's no isotopic fractionation between the rivers and the particles. So basically we have complete weathering, complete breakdown of all the material in that rock. And the closer this value, or the lower this value becomes, the more fractionation we see. And because during dissolution of carbonate material, we expect that to be complete, we don't get formation of secondary phases. You can see that most of the carbonate materials tend to have lower isotope fractionations, whereas the silicate material, particularly at high latitudes where weathering is much more superficial, because there's not much time for weathering to occur, we start to move to a more fractionated system. And this idea fits in nicely with terminology for weathering processes that were first put forward by Rolf Dallard and John Edmonds back in the early 80s, is that we have what we call a transport-limited weathering regime, where we have geomorphological equilibrium and little fractionation between the rock and the weathering products, where we have relatively little lithium isotope fractionation, and then we have what we call weathering-limited regimes, where we have considerable fractionation relative to the rock in these types of river system here. And because there hadn't been very much work done on lithium isotopes and very intense weathering regimes, all the data I showed you previously, you can see that there's still considerable isotope fractionation between the rock and the river water. I've recently been on a trip to Costa Rica, where of course we have intense tropical weathering. And what you can see here is that we have two elements basically. The local waters, which are saccharide, so they're very well developed lateritic materials. They have lithium isotope compositions that are very, very close to those of the local rock. Where we have mixing of those local waters in the saccharide, in these sort of very iron-rich streams here, with groundwaters that are derived from higher elevations, which principally have source of lithium from dissolution of primary minerals, we form a mixing line between the two elements. And this was a very interesting trip. I'd never been in a tropical weathering regime before, and doing the risk assessment for not just the crocodiles, but also for the poisonous snakes, took me quite some time. So for those of you going away on field work to these areas, just bear that in mind. Okay, so we've established that there's a relationship between the lithium isotopic composition of river waters and weathering intensity. But is there a relationship between the lithium isotopic composition of river waters and the silicate weathering rate? Which is that's the holy grail, that's what we really like to get to. Within this study here, which was done by a postdoc working with myself and others at the Open University, this was a study done in Iceland. And what we found here is that there did seem to be a correlation between lithium isotopic composition of river water and the silicate weathering rate, and that as the weathering rate increased, the lithium isotopic value of the river water decreased. So that looks quite nice. But of course, if we go to the global situation, things tend to become more complicated. So rather than plotting silicate weathering rate here, because it's not available for most of these rivers, I plotted the silicon concentration relative to the total concentration of cations in the river, which is used as a proxy for silicate weathering rates. You can see that on a global scale, we really don't see very much correlation at all. So the take-home message really is that the river water lithium isotope composition is telling us about weathering intensity. It may tell us about weathering rates if we have a relatively simple system, but on a global scale it probably hasn't. Okay, so that's fine. We've looked at the modern system now and we've tried to establish what the controls on the lithium isotope composition of river water are. But what we want to really do is to understand how weathering rates and weathering processes have changed over time. So how can we do that with lithium? Well, luckily, like strontium, the lithium isotope composition of seawater has a relatively simple mass balance. It's determined by the flux of lithium coming in from the rivers and the flux of lithium sourced from hydrothermal weathering of basaltic material at high temperature. Similarly, the sinks of lithium from seawater are uptake into marine basalt and sediments at low temperatures. This is the average lithium isotopic composition of global river water. This is the average lithium isotopic composition of hydrothermal fluids. They're quite different. But what you can see is that the lithium isotopic composition of seawater is heavier, is higher than either of its two sources. And the reason for this is, just like we see in the river waters, is during removal of lithium from seawater into basalts and sediments, the light isotope, lithium-6, is preferentially taken up into the secondary phases. But this system is reasonably well understood. And so if we can assume that the hydrothermal flux, the isotopic composition of that hydrothermal flux, is not likely to have changed over time. The flux itself probably varies as a function of seafloor spreading rate, so we can reconstruct how the hydrothermal flux will change over time. And the rest of the difference that we see in seawater must be due to a change in the isotopic composition of the river flux or lithium, or the quantity of lithium coming in from the rivers. So how do we establish a record of past changes in the lithium isotope composition of seawater? Well, like strontium, oxygen, carbon, lithium is taken up as a trace element into foraminifera. These are planktonic marine organisms that grow in the surface of the ocean if they're planktonic. Some do grow on the ocean floor as well. And they secrete shells made of calcium carbonate. On their death, these calcium carbonate shells are preserved in the marine sediments. And those marine sediments, they build up year upon year upon year upon year, and that allows us to reconstruct how the seawater environment has changed over time. So do these foreruns accurately record the lithium isotopic composition of seawater? Well, we've done a number of different studies, as well as which are available at the University of Bristol, on various different species of planktonic foraminifera. These are the spread and the lithium isotopic compositions of those different species that we observe. And this is the lithium isotopic composition of seawater. This is the mean value, and that's the standard deviation of measurements carried out by a whole range of different laboratories. So you can see that for most species, apart from those that have very, very thick called keels, outer parts of their shell, do seem to accurately record the lithium isotope composition of seawater. So that's good. We can use this as a record of past changes. So attempts have now been made then to reconstruct the lithium isotope composition of seawater from marine carbonates. This was the very first record that was published in the late 1990s. And the curious thing about this record, first of all, it was done on bulk carbonate rocks, so not the foraminiferous themselves, just any old carbonate sediment. The curious thing is that at the present day, they were unable to accurately reconstruct the present day lithium isotope composition of seawater, which is shown by this red line here. The other curious thing about this record is that they really saw very big and quite abrupt shifts in the lithium isotope composition of about 20 per mil or so. And it's really difficult to reconcile the lithium isotopic composition of seawater, knowing what we know about the isotopic composition of the river flux itself, and the isotopic composition of the hydrothermal flux and the hydrothermal flux itself. It's really difficult to obtain these sudden swings and large swings in the seawater lithium isotopes, knowing what we know about the budget. So this really didn't look very promising. A PhD student, my first PhD student in fact, Ed Hathorn and I, decided we would look at foraminifera themselves rather than bulk carbonates to see if perhaps we could do a better job. So this is the lithium isotope record that we've reconstructed using single species of planktonic foraminifera back over the past 20 million years. And the first thing to note is that we were able to accurately record the lithium isotopic composition of present-day seawater. And we did demonstrate that over the past 8 million years or so, or 10 million years, we haven't really seen very much change in the lithium isotope composition of seawater. But we do see a sudden drop at about 10 million years or so, which we attribute to changes in weathering rates towards the end of the glacial tides at that time. Since the study that Ed did, Aravinda Misra and Philip Froelich have gone on and done huge numbers of analyses looking at lithium isotopes in foranes and also other material as well. This is Ed's record shown in green here still, and this is Suvinder's record, which now extends back to the past 60 million years or so. And I think what you can see is that even though the material that we use was selected from all sorts of very different sites from all over the ocean, the records are really remarkably consistent. And Richard Abel at the University of Bristol, and he was working with Tim Elliott, has also done some work on this, and he looked at some exquisitely preserved foraminifera from clay-rich sediments offshore Tanzania. And again, although there is a small offset in the absolute value of the lithium isotopic composition of those foranes, the pattern that we see relative to the other records produced is remarkably consistent. And this offset, it may be partly analytical, but it may be due to all the other sites being open ocean sites, and this one is really right on the continental shelf. It may be influenced by other influences as well. So what have these records really told us, or what advances have they enabled us to make about our understanding of the links between weathering and climate change? Well, the first thing to note is that over the past 10 million years or so, the lithium isotopic composition of seawater seems to have been remarkably constant. We don't see this in the strontium isotope record of seawater. That's continued to increase over this time period. And what this suggests is that the lithium isotope composition of seawater is in steady state whereas the strontium isotopes are not. And this is consistent with some modelling work that Derek Barnes did that was published in 2009. What we can also see is that the lithium isotopic composition of seawater appears to have sharply increased between about 18 million years of the Pliocene. And this indicates that we've got a shift towards a weathering-limited regime. And that coincides with global cooling, but it does post-date the uplift of the Himalayas. So that sort of suggests that there is a hiatus between uplift and seeing significant shifts in global weathering rates. The next point of interest is here at around 55 million years ago, where we see a minimum in the lithium isotope composition of seawater. And that implies a lithium isotope composition of river water around 2 to 6 per mil, which will be very similar to the rocks that we find on line and indicates that we have a transport limiting regime. And in those situations, if we're not getting much weathering, we would expect to see high levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide. And that's exactly what we see at this time. We have the Paleocene, the Eocene thermal maximum occurring about 55 million years ago. And the other dramatic point is that at around the KT boundary, about 65 million years ago, we see a dramatic drop in the lithium isotope composition of seawater. A similar drop has been seen during an oceanic anoxic event about 94 million years ago. And this again implies a shift to higher weathering intensity regimes, but at least on those timescales, it doesn't mean that we necessarily have high weathering rates, which is how this drop in OAE2 was interpreted. Because we know that low lithium isotope compositions of seawater tend to be associated with tropical weathering regimes, that requires high levels of CO2. Okay, so lithium shows great promise as a trace of weathering processes, but I think there are still some issues that we need to address. The first thing is that we still poorly understand the fractionation associated with uptake of secondary minerals, and particularly differences in the fractionation between different secondary mineral phases. We still need to do some more work on this. There's still also poor understanding of the partitioning of lithium between fluid and secondary minerals. There's been a lot of modelling work attempting to explain these seawater lithium isotope records recently. But I think that they've completely got that partitioning of lithium between fluids and secondary minerals wrong, and they're starting to lead to difficult interpretations. And also the flux of lithium during uptake into the oceanic crust at low temperature also needs to be better finalised. I would advocate that we need more studies of lithium in rivers, and also we need to better understand the validity of doing bulk carbonate analyses, reconstructing seawater lithium, because that's the only tool that's going to be available to us if we go and try to get it back in time. Okay, so rather more briefly, I just want to talk about the utility of magnesium isotopes as well as a weathering tracer. So like lithium, the magnesium and magnesium isotope budget of seawater is relatively straightforward. Magnesium in seawater is completely derived from rivers. There's no hydrothermal input because, in fact, hydrothermal exchange takes magnesium out of seawater. It's the principal sink for magnesium in seawater. Magnesium is also removed on clays and by dolomite precipitation. So again, we have a relatively simple cycle. What are the controls on the magnesium isotope composition of river waters? Well, most studies suggest that river water is enriched in the light magnesium isotopes. So it's the opposite for lithium, which is enriched in lithium-7, relative to the rock, suggesting that it's the heavy magnesium isotopes being taken from secondary minerals. This is the same plot I showed for lithium, but here we have magnesium in river water and magnesium in the suspended particulate materials. You'll see that most of those data fall above this line because the river water is enriched in the light isotope. The soil studies support this. If we look at this diagram here, this is the bulk soil, and these are clay-rich elements. And again, they seem to be enriched in heavy isotope because of what preferential was the light isotope. The other difference between lithium and magnesium is that magnesium, of course, has a biological control as well. Lithium is not involved in, or to any significant extent, in biological activity, whereas magnesium is. We can see in this study here, which was done on the Norwegian spruce, is that the roots shown here preferentially take up heavy magnesium isotopes, and then as magnesium is translocated through the tree into the wood and then the leaves and needles, the light isotopes are preferentially translocated and stored in the blood-bearing parts. I should just point out, though, that cyanobacteria preferentially utilize light magnesium to form chlorophyll A. Unlike lithium, there also does appear to be a small geological control on the, or lithological control on the magnesium isotope composition of river waters. And that's simply that carbonates always have a light magnesium isotope composition. And so any rivers that drain predominantly carbonate catchments tend to have a lighter isotopic signal relative to river catchments that drain mixed ecologies. Okay, so like lithium, can we obtain a record of magnesium isotopes in seawater? So again, we look to the marine carbonates to provide us with this record. And what you can see from this diagram here, which shows the difference in the magnesium isotope composition of the carbonate relative to the solution in which that carbonate forms, is that the value of 0 will be no isotope fractionation, which is what we see for lithium. But you can see that for almost any type of carbonate material, calcite, aragonite, biologically formed or inorganically formed, everything lies to the left here. So the carbonate phases are always enriched in the light isotope relative to the solution in which they formed. There's also potentially a temperature dependency on the isotope composition of the carbonate phase that forms, and also potentially a precipitation rate effect. So again, unlike lithium, magnesium is more complicated because there is a significant fractionation during removal of magnesium from seawater and its incorporation into carbonate phases. However, it's not stopping people trying to reconstruct the magnesium isotope composition of seawater in the past. These are data, the symbols here show data produced on bulk carbonate phases by John Higgins. And what he suggests is, the bottom of this core is about 20 million years, that there's been no change in the magnesium isotope composition of seawater over the past 20 million years. And this is maybe a bit surprising because it's thought that there has been a reasonably significant rise of about 15 millimoles rise in seawater magnesium concentrations over that time period. And there are records at the moment for the whole of the Cenozoic being worked on by Philip who was a PhD student of mine, who's now at University College London, and also John Higgins. So really we'll see what comes out of that. So to summarise, I guess my take-home messages are that most of the lithium in river water is derived from weathering of silicates. Primary control of the lithium isotopic composition of river water is fractionation during secondary mineral formation, and that the delta-7 lithium value of the rivers reflects weathering intensity. We have a low value, we have a transport-limited weathering regime, so we're in geological equilibrium. If we have high delta-7 lithium values, we tend to be in transport-limited regimes where kinetic processes are important. We can reconstruct the lithium isotopic composition of seawater using foreign-ephora, and the records that we have today are remarkably consistent. And there's just some examples of shown here of where I think the lithium isotopes have made a contribution to our knowledge. And I also think that magnesium can also potentially provide important information on weathering processes. But it's important to note that biological controls may be important, and interpretation of the records that we produce from marine carbonates is likely to be complex. Okay, and before I end, I should just thank, you can see that there's a lot of work that I've described there, very rapidly. I hope you don't mind that. And of course that's been done by my PhD students, Ed Hathel, Bashak Kisakurek, Joe Stewart, Philip von Straven, Joshua Penny and Sarah Wright, and my postdocs and collaborators who are all the other people I've listed there. And these are the bodies that